If you're studying for Security Plus, learning Python, building penetration testing labs, reading about cloud security, and researching compliance frameworks all at the same time, you might think you're doing everything right. You're working hard, you're covering multiple areas, you're building a strong foundation. But here's the problem. You're preparing for 5 different jobs, and employers are trying to fill one specific role. That disconnect is costing people time, money, and real opportunities to get into the field. So I see this pattern constantly, when working with career changers and students entering cybersecurity. They collect certifications across multiple domains. They build labs and touch every security specialty there is. They study offensive security, compliance, cloud, protection, and incident response all at once. They believe this broad preparation makes them, versatile and employable. What it actually does is make them unprepared for any specific position. And the frustrating part is that these aren't lazy people. They're working incredibly hard. They're investing significant time and money, but they're solving the wrong problem. They're preparing for cybersecurity as though it were a single destination, where it's actually a collection of fundamentally different career paths, different skills, different backgrounds, different preparation strategies. You can't prepare for cybersecurity in general because cybersecurity is not a general job. You have to choose a specific role within the field. Understand what that role actually requires, and then intentionally build the skills, knowledge, and credentials that prepare you for the particular destination. Why cybersecurity isn't just one path is what you may be thinking or asking. When someone tells me that they want to work in cybersecurity, that statement contains almost no useful information about what they actually want to do each day. Think about what a SOC analyst does compared to a GRC analyst. The SOC analyst spends their day monitoring security alerts, analyzing logs, investigating potential incidents, determining whether unusual activity represents a genuine threat. They need pattern recognition skills. They need familiarity with SIM tools. They need to understand attack techniques and triage alerts quickly. They work in a technical environment, often with the shift work and clear escalation procedures. A GRC analyst works in an entirely different world. They assess organizational compliance with regulatory requirements. They document security controls. They coordinate audits. They communicate risks to businesses, and the stakeholders. Right? They maintain policy documentation. They need to understand control frameworks like NIST or ISO 27001. They need to translate technical security concepts for non-technical audiences. Their work is less technical and more procedural, focused on governance rather than technical detection. These are not variations of the same job. They require different skill sets. They attract different personality types. They follow different career trajectories. A penetration tester needs deep technical knowledge of exploitation techniques, offensive security controls, vulnerability assessments, and strong reporting skills. Whereas a security engineer designs and implements security controls, which requires understanding network architecture, system administration, automation even, and infrastructure security. A cloud security specialist needs enterprise and or expertise really more in cloud platforms, identity and access management, infrastructure as a code as well. Each of these represents a different career path with different entry requirements, different daily responsibilities, and just different advancement opportunities. So what happens with scattered preparation? So what happens when someone prepares broadly without choosing a specific destination? They struggle to tell a coherent story to employers. When a hiring manager looks at a resume showing Security Plus, OSCP, AWS security training, and a project portfolio spanning penetration testing, compliance documentation, and SIM configuration, they can't determine what role this candidate is prepared to fill. The candidate thinks they look well-rounded and capable of multiple functions, which may look true. The hiring manager sees someone who studied many things but mastered nothing relevant to the specific position they need to fill. I've seen this play out when comparing candidates for the same security position. One candidate had certifications and across multiple domains. Security Plus, which makes sense, but also OSCP for penetration testing, some cloud security training, and they built projects that touch compliance, offensive security, and SOC work. On paper, it looked impressive, but when we started asking specific questions about the SOC analyst role, they were applying for, they struggled. They could explain basic concepts across all these areas, but they couldn't demonstrate depth in the actual skills a SOC analyst uses every day. They hadn't really practiced log analysis in depth. They didn't have strong familiarity with common attack patterns. They couldn't walk through, how they'd investigate a real security event from start to finish. Another candidate had a much more focused preparation. They had Security Plus and had built a home lab specifically for practicing SOC work. They'd analyze packet captures. They'd investigate simulated security incidents. They'd written detection rules. They could explain their thought process when triaging alerts. If I'm evaluating those two candidates, the second one gives me much clear evidence that they're ready to perform the actual job. The first candidate worked very hard, but that effort was scattered across too many directions, demonstrating readiness for a specific role. This scattered preparation also wastes significant resources. Certifications are expensive. Study time is limited. When someone pursues the CISSP, OSCP, or CCSP, simultaneously without understanding, which roles each certification supports, they're spending thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours on credentials that may not align with any realistic career path available to them right now. So how employers actually hire, is something that may come to mind that I'll touch on as well. Understanding the hiring perspective, does clarify why focused preparation matters. And it's important, right? Employers write job descriptions for specific roles with specific responsibilities. A SOC analyst, position lists requirements like expertise with SIM platforms, knowledge of common attacks, and the different patterns of them, of course, ability to analyze network traffic, familiarity with incident response procedures. Our GRC analyst position lists different requirements, knowledge of compliance frameworks, experience documenting different security controls, the ability to coordinate audits, strong written communication skills as well. Hiring managers evaluate candidates against these specific requirements. They're asking whether this person can perform this particular function. They look for evidence, the candidate has practiced the relevant skills, understands the relevant tools, and can contribute quickly to this specific team. When a candidate represents, or presents, focused preparation aligned with the role, the hiring manager sees a clear fit. The candidate studied the right certifications. They built projects demonstrating the right skills. They can articulate why they pursue this specific, preparation path. The story makes sense. When a candidate presents scattered preparation across unrelated domains, the hiring manager faces uncertainty. Why did this person study offensive security if they're applying for a compliance role? Why do they have cloud certifications if they want to work in a SOC? They're generally, are they generally interested, in this position, or are they applying broadly and hoping something works? That uncertainty typically results in the candidate not advancing, regardless of how much total effort they invested. As far as choosing your destination, the solution begins with choosing, and focusing on that destination, right, before, heavily investing in preparation. Start by researching actual job postings for roles that interest you, not generic career path descriptions, not certification marketing materials, actual job postings from real employers looking to fill real positions. Read 10 to 15 postings for SOC analyst roles. Read another 10 for GRC analyst positions. Read more for penetration testers, security engineers, security administrators. Notice what skills appear repeatedly. What tools do employers expect candidates to know? What certifications they list as required or preferred? What prior experience do they mention? This research reveals several critical things. First, you'll identify which roles are realistic entry points. Some positions like SOC analyst, junior GRC analyst, or security administrator commonly accept candidates without prior security experience if they demonstrate strong IT foundations and relevant certifications. Other roles like penetration tester, security architect, or security engineer typically require several years of prior experience in IT, even development or security even. Understanding which roles represent realistic first destinations prevents you from preparing for positions that you can't reasonably obtain without intermediate steps. And second, you'll see clear patterns of what in what each role requires. SOC analyst positions consistently mention SIM tools, log analysis, incident response, threat detection. GRC positions consistently mention frameworks like NIST and ISO and audit coordination, policy development, risk assessments. Right? These patterns tell you what to prepare for if you choose that destination. Choose one realistic destination role based on this research. Write it down. Use it as a filter for every subsequent preparation decision. And maybe try working backwards from your destination. Once you've identified your destination role, you can determine what preparation generally supports that specific path. If your destination is a SOC analyst position, you need a foundational networking knowledge, understanding of common attack techniques, familiarity with log analysis and SIM platforms, and practical experience investigating security events. Security Plus makes sense as a certification, but it covers the fundamental concepts SOC analysts use daily. Building a home lab where you practice analyzing packet captures or investigating simulated incidents and writing detection rules demonstrates relevant skills. If your destination is a GRC analyst position, you need understanding of compliance frameworks, knowledge of risk assessment methodologies, strong documentation skills, and the ability to communicate security concepts to business stakeholders. Security Plus still provides useful foundation, but certifications like the CISA or the CISA become more relevant. Building a portfolio that includes policy, templates, control mapping documentation, or risk assessment reports demonstrates relevant skills. Notice how the preparation paths diverge very quickly. The right certification really depends on your destination. The right projects depend on your destination. The right technical depth depends on, you guessed it, your destination. This focused approach produces depth rather than superficial breadth. You develop an actual competence in the skills your target role requires. You can speak credibly, about tools, processes, and challenges relevant to that specific function. You present a clear story to employers about what job you're ready to perform. And what about keeping other options open, right? That may come up as well as a question. Some people resist choosing a specific destination because they fear making the wrong decision or limiting future opportunities. This concern is understandable, but it's a bit misplaced. Cybersecurity professionals commonly move between different security functions over the course of their career. I'm a perfect example. Someone might start as a SOC analyst, move into a threat intelligence, then transition to security engineering. Career paths within cybersecurity are rarely linear, but you need to get into that field first, right? That requires landing your first security position. Focused preparation for a realistic entry role significantly increases your likelihood of getting that first opportunity. Once you have security experience, transitioning to other security roles becomes substantially easier. You understand how security functions within an organization. You have credibility that comes from doing security work professionally. You can build new skills while employed rather than trying to prepare for everything before getting hired. Attempting to keep all options open by preparing broadly for everything simultaneously often means you really never get that critical first position. Choosing a direction doesn't permanently lock you into one narrow path. It gives you a realistic strategy for entering the field. Everything becomes easier after that. And here's some practical steps that may help too. If you recognize yourself in this pattern of scattered preparation, here's how you can refocus your approach. Right, first, research specific cybersecurity positions for roles that genuinely interest you. Analyze what skills, experience, tools, and certifications appear repeatedly in those descriptions. Build a clear picture of what employers actually want for that role. Second, choose one realistic destination role based on your current background, skills, interests, and the entry requirements you identified. This becomes your filter for all subsequent decisions about what to study, which certifications to pursue, and what projects to build even. Third, go ahead and map out the foundational knowledge and skills required for your specific destination. Identify what you already have and what you need to develop. Prioritize depth in areas directly relevant to your destination over breadth across unrelated domains. Fourth, select certifications that directly support your chosen role rather than collecting credentials across multiple unrelated specializations. One or two targeted certifications tell a clearer, stronger story, right, than 5 scattered ones. And fifth, build projects and lab experience that demonstrate your ability to perform specific functions required by the destination role. Focus on quality, relevance, over quantity and variety. Cybersecurity isn't one career path. It's dozens of distinct roles requiring different skills, different backgrounds, different preparation strategies. The most effective way to enter this field is to choose a specific destination role first, then work backward to build a foundation that generally prepares you for that particular position. You don't need to prepare for every security role. You need to prepare for one realistic entry role well enough to get hired. Everything else becomes easier once you have that first position and actual security experience. Take action today. Find 5 job postings for cybersecurity roles that interest you. Read them carefully, notice what they actually require, choose one realistic destination, then start building the specific skills that role needs rather than trying to prepare for everything at once. If this changed how you're thinking about your preparation strategy, subscribe to the channel. I regularly talk about practical career decisions in cybersecurity and IT, and I'd appreciate having you here for those conversations. Talk to you later.